Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. Welcome. Thank you. It's so nice to see all of you. Um, Thank you so much for coming to this really exciting and interesting conversation. I can't wait to dive in. My name is Brandon Marshall. I'm a professor in epidemiology here and director of the People, Place, and Health Collective. And it is such a pleasure to be in conversation today with Abdul El-Sayed. So I'm going to introduce him, and then we're going to have a chat, and then leave lots of times for questions from the audience. And Abdul is willing to stay afterwards as well. So if you'd like to mingle and meet him and chat, we just need to get him to the airport around 3. So that's the plan for this afternoon. All right, so it is such an honor to introduce Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. He is director of the Department of Health, Human and Veteran Services for Wayne County in Michigan. He's also a policymaker in residence at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. He's a public servant, Michigan politician, and former epidemiology professor at Columbia University, which is where we met many, many years ago. He was also the executive director of the Detroit Health Department between 2015 and 2017 before resigning to run for the governor of Michigan in 2017. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. He's also a political contributor at CNN, the author of Healing Politics, a doctor's journey into the heart of our political epidemic, and Medicare for All, a Citizen's Guide, as well as his newsletter, The Incision. And he's also the host of a podcast, America Dissected, which I encourage you to check out. In 2020, he served on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Healthcare. He's received an undergraduate degree in biology and political science from the University of Michigan, and his MD degree is from Columbia University. And finally, he's also was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where he completed a doctorate in public health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. El-Sayed.
Thank you so much.
So I wanted to dive right in, Abdul. You know, we met each other many, many years ago at Columbia. I was a postdoc and you were an early career faculty member. And since that time, you've taken many twists and turns in your career, and you're now serving as a director of a large health department in Wayne County. So I just would love to know sort of like what drove you towards politics and working in professional public health away from academia, I guess. What was some of the decisions that took you to this place where you are today?
Yeah, first, I just want to say how grateful I am to be here with you. Professor Marshall's been just incredibly welcoming and got the opportunity to meet some of your team. So I just really, really appreciate the hospitality in the space. You know, I grew up, my parents immigrated to this country from Egypt. And I can imagine there are probably some children of immigrants here, but like the way it went in my family was before the school year ended, I was usually on a plane to Cairo through Schiphol Airport, usually with somebody else's family. And they bought the tickets then because they were always cheaper. And so I'd spend most of my summers with my family there, extremely working class. And most of my time was with my Teta Soad. She was the wisest, most intelligent person I have ever met, but she never got to go to school. And she had 6 kids that she raised, 2 additional kids that died before the age of 1. So she had a personal infant mortality rate of 25%. And I didn't have the language for this at the time, but in the 15 hours it would take me to get to Egypt, I'd travel about 10 years difference in life expectancy. And what was crazy to me is that I actually didn't have to go to Egypt because I grew up just outside the city of Detroit. I go 15 minutes into the city and travel the same life expectancy gap. And that realization crystallized for me about what I wanted to do. I wanted my work to be about fixing that. So I thought the best way to do that was to become a doctor. And I went all the way through my medical training only to realize in my final couple of years that I was training in large part to be a part of a system that wasn't just part of the solution, but was actually too often part of the problem. And decided in my final year that I didn't want to train clinically and was a lot more interested in the space, in the moments in people's lives that they were outside of the clinic, the places where they lived and worked and prayed and played. And so that's where I wanted to spend my career. And I thought then I was going to do that as a researcher. And that's where we got to cross paths and really enjoyed the research work in terms of the puzzles that I was trying to solve and the methodological inquiry. But I found myself floating further and further into methodological work and further away from the problems that I wanted to solve. And for me, the voice in my mind that I always went back to was my teta's voice. Could I explain what I was doing, and would she be proud of me, right? And I kept sort of coming to this thing of like, A, I probably couldn't explain what I was doing, and B, she probably would say, there's more that you should be doing. And I'm going to pivot here for a second, just in my answer, because when I talk to young people who are just thinking about their careers, I often encourage them to think past the question we ask most young people when they're kids. People ask my kids this all the time: what do you want to be when you grow up? And that assumes both a process and an outcome. And I actually think that architecting a career of purpose requires you to decouple those questions. What do you want to change in the world, I think, is the better question. And then how do you want to change it? And I realized that for me, what I wanted to change in the world was very clear. I wanted to change the fact that some people don't get access to a long, healthy life, and they too often look like people like my teta. Whether that's in places like Alexandria, Egypt, or places like Detroit. How I wanted to change it, that was a different question. And I had thought that I was going to do it as a doctor, and then I thought I was going to do it as a professor, and I think I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to do it. But one thing that was clear to me was it took me a second to actually have to self-discover beyond some of the biases of what I was told I was good at. And I'll just say this, when you tell people when you're a kid that you want to be a doctor, nobody's ever like, why would you want to do something silly like that with your life, right? Everyone's like, oh, that's great. And so I thought that that's what I was good at, and I was good enough at it. But I think what became a lot clearer was the tool that I really enjoyed using and used best was the ability to lead a group of people, set a vision, and execute on it, and the ability to motivate just with words, to write and to speak. And so I really, when I think about it now, is I want to use words and leadership to solve that problem of health inequity. And I think the pathway and the positionality of doing that may change, but I hope that that's a North Star. And I also hope that explains kind of why I jumped around so much. And the one point I'll make to all of you here is I would really encourage everybody to spend a little bit of time outside of the institutions that you spend most of your time in. Because I think sometimes, particularly in the academy, we think about the world in a way that is structured in accordance with the incentives of this particular space, and you think the rest of the world works like that. And it often does. Actually, it never does. And only by exposing yourself to those kinds of spaces can you actually start to ask, okay, what kinds of institutions do I want to be a part of, and how do I leverage those institutions to do the thing and the work that I care a lot about? And I really am grateful that I've been able to work in everything from academia to government to politics to media, and thinking through what are the uses of these different kinds of institutions. How do you architect something that's greater than the sum of the whole? And how do you then leverage the totality of the opportunities that these different institutions give you to try and do something to move the ball down the field? And the last thing I'll say is this. I think sometimes we're taught to chase certain markers of validation. And I think the faster we all let go of whatever those markers are, if I achieve this, I'll have succeeded, the faster you can get onto the work of succeeding beyond what you define as success, but success around actually trying to work on the problem that you care a lot about.
That's great. So I want to chat more about your current position in a moment, but we are here to talk about what's next for public health. And I think many of us, I can say, are struggling with how to navigate working in public health right now with this new administration. So I was just hoping you could reflect a little bit on what these past 2 weeks of this new Trump administration has meant for you, what that's looked like, and how it impacts your role really as a director of a county health department.
It's been wild. I mean, waking up in the morning to a barrage of will I have a job tomorrow? It's not great. I don't recommend it. And there have been challenges. many of us had thought could happen, but had never really thought were really within the realm of possibility, that are happening all the time. I mean, we go in the span of a week from, all right, what guidance do we give our federally qualified health center workers about how to think about how to protect your patients when ICE comes knocking, to, okay, a third of my public health budget may be at risk. How long can I float our WIC program if we don't get federal funds through the state? To thinking about, okay, if they eliminate all of the CDC data that we leverage every single day, how do we store it? Do we get in trouble for storing it? Like, what would that actually mean? And how do we work with folks who can do these analyses for us? So a lot of the infrastructure that we've taken for granted in public health is starting to rock and to shake. And then there's the bigger picture question of saying, okay, what is the argument that has been made to people to justify this? And where is the delta between what they actually expected versus what's happening now? And can we leverage that delta to make a counter argument about why a lot of this work doesn't actually help them, right? I mean, my office overlooks Canada, and there are bridges and tunnels that I can see from my office. And every day they're lined with trucks that are filled with different auto parts in different states of construction, going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth across those bridges. So, it's nice and it's cute to say, oh, we're gonna punish Canada for what? I don't know, right? Like, every Canadian I've ever met, including Brandon, like, they apologize, like, prophylactically,
Ad nauseam, yeah.
right? Like, it's like, you don't even do anything yet, and they're like, I'm sorry. You're like, sorry for what? What? I didn't even do anything. Right? But the thing about it is, I'm like, what are we doing here? And if you think that taxing the American public, which is what a tariff is, right, to get at some grudge that makes you feel a little bit stronger today with some country that, by the way, is like, they can't choose to go away. They're going to be our neighbors forever. Like, that's how geography works. That's going to somehow help and lower the price of eggs? Not going to happen. So I just think that there is also a space for us to be establishing the track record on a conversation that is not with him and them, but instead is with all those folks who got so pissed off with government that they felt like, you know what, I'm just gonna break it, right? Because, Brandon and I were talking earlier, it's like, what do you do with a machine that's not working the way you want? My first instinct is to throw it on the ground. That's kind of a human thing, right? It's just like, it's not working. I think our the better angels of our nature will be like, actually, wait, maybe I should open it up. Maybe I should think a little bit about how it works and improve its function. But in the moment, you're like, it's not working. And I kind of think that's what the American public did. And I think we have to meet them where they are, and we have to be ready to say, okay, so now it's on the ground broken. I don't think anybody who's ever thrown their phone down looks at it and be like, that was a great decision. I'm really grateful it's now got a cracked screen and I can only call 3 people, none of whom I really want to call, right? Nobody thinks that. So we've got to be there to be ready to say, okay, you had your temper tantrum. I understand, because it really hasn't been working in the ways that you expect it to work. And a lot of the folks who've told you they're going to make it work better haven't really been listening to you. What now? And I think that's where we need to have a conversation. So, like, beyond trying to, like, live in that phone, I don't know how far I'm going to torture this metaphor, but, like, being in that phone and being like, okay, how can we keep this from breaking entirely? It's also saying, all right, like, people have had a temper tantrum and it's going to hurt a lot of other people. So we got to protect those folks who are going to get hurt by this, but we also got to be ready to explain and narrate what is happening to win the future.
And on that note, what I've seen too is a lot of disenchantment with public health, or fear among public health professionals. How do we move forward in this moment? What does this look like? Fear of retaliation potentially right now we're experiencing as well. How do you navigate some of those feelings? Do you put up your hands and say, how do I engage? Do you lean in? How do we navigate this moment in public health where I really feel, honestly, we've lost many of the public sort of with us? How do we bring them back on to the core mission of public health?
Yeah, that's the big question. I'll say a couple of things on this. The first one is, buckle up. This is going to be a long fight. And the thing about this work and any confrontational experienced is it's not about who you're fighting with, it's about who you're fighting for. And I think we just got to be really clear about that. And they should be enough for us to keep doing this work, number one. Number two, I think we have had this approach. We've allowed ourselves as a field to be marginalized out of the fights that matter most. And so I think we've been in agents of our own irrelevance for a very long time. And I think we assumed that during COVID, that the public was out there waiting to listen to what we had to say. They were just waiting for our feedback. And most of them didn't know we existed. And I think that the lesson for us is, how do we make sure that we're showing up in situations that are outside of the context of a huge national or international disaster? Because that's like when we show up. I had this experience of like being a public health director, then running for political office, then coming back to being a public communicator and then a public health director again. And the weird thing about that cycle is that when I was a public health director the first time, people were a lot more willing to listen to what I had to say because it wasn't as politicized. And then when I ran for office, I learned a lot about how to communicate into a non-neutral communications environment, right? How do you talk to people who are talking against you, or in a situation where people already have a preconceived notion of who you are, right? And then I came back to this work where all of a sudden that ability to speak in a adversarial environment became that much more important, right? We are no longer communicating out into the void. We are communicating into gale force winds of people who want to destroy trust in what we do. So we have to think strategically about how to do that. But more importantly, it's like showing up when people know they need you. So the example I always make is like, imagine you're somebody who's diabetic and you're in that weird donut hole between having Medicaid eligibility and not. And you can barely afford your insulin, okay? And you've known you need insulin because you feel it when you don't get it, all right? And then all of a sudden, the people who are the public health people show up in the context of this huge pandemic, and they're like, here's a medication that didn't exist last year, and we think you should take it. And you're not even sick with the disease that this is supposed to prevent. You're like, yo, but what about my insulin though, right? You all didn't show up to give me the medicine I knew I needed, and now you all want to show up to give me medicine I'm not so sure I need. And we don't think of ourselves in that directive. We're like, oh, well, that's a healthcare problem. Well, let me tell you all, like, people don't differentiate between public health and healthcare. That's like a thing we do, right? Most people are like, it has health in the word, and you like to tell me that you have a doctorate, so you're the same. And we got to decide that we're no longer going to allow ourselves to be marginalized by the folks who have not showed up for insulin, and be willing to pick those fights. And to do so in a time when people are not paying attention to public health. Because if you want to build trust, trust is not about what you say. Like, we keep doing this thing, it's like, well, we have to communicate this way and that way so people trust us. No, trust is about what you do. In your daily life, you could tell somebody, I love you so much and I'll always be there for you. And then they're like, hey, this is the day I need you. You're like, wait, what? Who is this? Too much static. I dropped my phone. I threw it on the ground, right? So that violates trust. So it's about what you do, not just what you say. So I think we got to be in the business of doing and then be in the business of saying. And then it comes to what we actually say. And I'm just gonna be like, some of y'all are gonna want to throw me out of this room here, okay? Intellect is not about using big words for small ideas. It's about using small words for big ideas. We have debates about the meanings of words that are meaningless to people who are not in these rooms. Like, the word equity outside of a room like this is how much of something you own. That's your equity, okay? Intersectionality. Intersections are places where two roads meet. So we use these terms with our goal of being inclusive that don't mean things to the people we say we're trying to include. And then we have big debates about them, and then we shame other people for not using them the right way in the spirit of inclusion. And that's a problem. So when it comes to the way we talk, it's not about the right words. It's about all the people. And so I just think we've got to really rethink the conversations we have in places like this, because they come out, right, outside of places like this. And we're wondering why people don't understand what we have to say when we talk in ways that are specifically intended to otherize people because we want to feel real smart, right? And the other problem with this is like, I mean, it's hard for me not to like end every conclusion with "and big tech is bad," but the first iteration of "and big tech is bad" is that we've been tricked into thinking that we have these huge platforms that are analogous to platforms everywhere else. The algorithm is very good at showing you two kinds of content: stuff that they know you're going to agree with and stuff they know you're not. Okay? And so if that's you, that's everybody, right? And a lot of times when we put messaging out there, we are looking to signal to people who already agree with us that we're down for the cause. But saying things louder to people who already agree with you is not a great way to speak to people who don't agree with you, right? And so I just think we've got to be real smart about the way that that has programmed our method of speaking and what we think is a good argument. And there's a level of humility that we have to accept when we're engaging in this. So the question I always get when I'm out in the community, when we're talking about vaccines, it's like, Doc, literally, I had a mom just like, Doc, stop telling me what to do. Tell me what you do. I said, well, I got 2 little daughters, and all of them were vaccinated as soon as they could be vaccinated. Why? Because measles, I saw pictures of that. I don't want to see that on my little girls' bodies. That's it. So that's knowing what I know, that's what I did. So that's all I got to hear.
So this might be a good segue to a conversation we were having earlier about RFK Jr. And the fact that many people, perhaps in this room and in public health generally, do agree to some extent with some of the ideas that he's putting forth, despite his anti-vaccine and anti-science views. What do you do with that, Abdul? Right? Like, we've got this person who is conspiratorial, anti-science, but yet maybe there is something there. How do we maybe draw attention to those things that we agree with and not giving that even more of a platform?
I really appreciate the question. It's funny because, like, we've been saying these things for a very long time, right? and all of a sudden he's found a niche of people, and he's been able to galvanize. And you got to give credit where credit's due. One of my guilty pleasures is like fitness TikTok and Instagram, and it's been interesting watching how that fitness community has really wrapped its arms around him. And I think the issue is it's almost aesthetic. People want to believe that they can own the science, that they don't have to go to oracles to get interpretations of the science. And I think he gives them that. And the interesting thing about it is when you listen to him speak, he's right about most of the problems. He's wrong about most of the solutions. And I think one of the heuristics of this current moment that we have to very assiduously avoid is the one that tells us that every action shall have an equal and opposite reaction on social media. So whatever he says is wrong, and we have to oppose what he says, right? And that's a tough thing to do because that's the lesson is they said this, so we say this. And if that's the case, then they get to decide what the message is going to be. And so what we got to do is take back our message and talk about the problems and then also talk about the solutions, right? And then in the places where he's wrong, we've just got to be like, that's just not true, and this is where this comes from. And by the way, he's selling you onesies that celebrate the fact that your kid's now at higher risk of dying of a disease you could easily prevent. So if you like that, I guess that's your kink, but it's weird. But also, right, he's right about our food environment. He's right about big ag. He's right about the way that corporations have been able to buy access and to prevent the kind of regulation that would give us a far more healthy food environment. He's right about those things. So in some respects, you'd be like, yeah, he's right about the solution. About the problem, but let's actually talk about how we fix it, right? And by the way, we got receipts. We've been talking about this for a minute. He didn't just discover this, okay? And so I just think we have to, there's my good friend Anat Shankar-Osorio, who's a messaging guru, says this thing, and it's every time I start talking about messaging, I'm always like, yeah, this is the truth. Say what you're for. Say what you're for. We do a lot of saying what we're against, right? And like deplatforming what we're against, and like, but just say what you're for. And that's a very clarifying thing, because there's two parts of it. Say, right, is not about what you not say. It's about what you say and then what you're for. And so there's this idea, for example, that like we should have ceded a lot of spaces because the people who leverage those spaces have viewpoints that we would disagree with and frankly find an anathema, right? And I'll say this as a Arab American Muslim, right? There are a lot of people who don't believe that people like me should be in this country. And you know what? The best thing I can do is debate them kindly. You know why? Because I may not change their opinion, but there's always going to be people who watch. And the audience is who I'm talking to. They're just a platform for me to talk to their audience, right? And it turns out that when you yell at people a lot, they usually don't like you, right? It's like basic parenting. Like, don't yell at your kids a lot. Like, it usually doesn't work. They don't listen, and then they just don't like you, right? So usually when you want to win someone over, they need to find you compelling and interesting and nice. So let's be compelling and interesting and nice, right? There's this idea, you know, the whole Joe Rogan discourse. But like, yeah, we probably should go on Rogan. We probably should, right? Like, do I agree with Rogan about everything? No. Are there things that I agree with Joe Rogan about? I'm sure, right? I don't know what they are exactly, but like maybe in a 2.5 hour conversation, we find out, right? But the fact that we don't agree is exactly why I want to talk to him. Why? Because he's got a lot of people who listen to him who don't agree, and I want them to agree. So the best way to get them to agree is not to shame them for not agreeing. It's to have a conversation with them about what I think they should agree on. And even if they don't like agree afterwards, I'm gonna keep coming, right? And the one thing I'll leave you with, when I ran for office, I got a really good piece of advice, which was there are no permanent no's. So like you reach out to people and you ask them for money, or you ask them for your vote, and you're asking people for things all the time. Like you're a glorified beggar. And the thing I would always do was when somebody told me no, I wouldn't stop calling them until they told me no 4 times. And the last time was like, please stop talking to me, right? And even then, I might be like, well, how about a couple months from now, right? And the funny thing is, there were people who were like, no, I will not support you. No, I don't agree with you. No, I think you're stupid and have funny hair. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then by the end of it, you see them at a rally. They're like, this is great, Abdul. I'm so excited about your race. I'm like, it's funny how that works. And the difference is, I think our instinct sometimes is to be like, oh, you don't support me? I don't support you either, right? Like, F you back. But I need them to support me in the end, right? And I need them to think a certain way in the end. So like, the best I can do is just keep coming, right? And I think we're too quick to close doors.
So I've got 2 more questions, if you don't mind, and then we'll go to questions. We've got a lot of students in the room. So I was hoping you could reflect a little bit, or if you have any advice for them on what it's like to enter politics or public health service, or both in your case.
I think I used to recommend it to everybody. I don't anymore. And it's not because I don't love public service, but it's just because I realize like I love public service and other people may not, right? But there's something about, I think, being able to close your eyes at the end of the night. I think the only person, like true actual human being that you're ever really accountable to in the very end is like yourself as you fall asleep, right? People, you know, I think if you're somebody of moral integrity, that's the hardest thing. If you fall asleep and there's always that thing that bugs you about something that you have to go fix tomorrow. And there's something about a life in public service where rarely do you fall asleep thinking, I wonder if I did the right thing today, right? And like there are obviously decisions and choices that you make where you're like, oh, I could have done that better, or I need to like repair that. But like at its existential, like I don't usually fall asleep and ask, I wonder if I'm doing the right thing by people today. So that's an amazing thing. But it tends to be kind of thankless. Public health and public service are not en vogue. Oftentimes the people you help, you never get to meet. And there's just a lot of noise. And sometimes you just got to deal with a lot of noise. And there are days when I'm like, how is this related to this? I don't understand. But this was like half my day. But in the end, the question of like, okay, can we create a place that all of us want to be and feel included, where people live their best life, and you look around and you say, I had a part in doing that. That is, to me, the most fulfilling part. And I just say that, like, I think it's really important for folks to think a little bit about what you get out of your work. So, from the most material to the most esoteric, when you work, you get a paycheck. There's also perks that come with any job. There's positionality. There's a skill set, like doing work that's fun and meaningful to you. Then there's like contentment, fulfillment, and legacy, right? And I think it's important for folks when you're looking at your future career to ask, where do I put my eggs in these baskets? And I think for a lot of us do-gooders in rooms like this, we're like, no, like anybody who's just working for a paycheck, no, a lot of people work for a paycheck, either because they have to or because that's the way they're built. And you know what? Like there's a lot of good you can do if you get a really big paycheck and give away a lot of it, right? There is. But I think it's important for you to actually step back and say, what do I want out of my career, right? Like, what is it that I value in a job? Because I think a lot of people never actually have that conversation with themselves. And then they're saying they want a certain thing because that's like the thing that you should say, but they're not honest with themselves about what they really want, right? And so if you're somebody who cares a lot about fulfillment and legacy and like want to leave something, I would say public service is a great way to build your career. If you're somebody who cares about contentment, like it's not a very contenting life. If you're somebody who cares about a paycheck, not in this iteration of government, okay? But like, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that like, there are more remunerating things that you can do. But I do think it behooves you to have that conversation with yourself. The last thing I'd say is, I think one of the big unsaid discussions that like we're almost too individualistic to even have as a society is what it means to build a community worth living in, right? And I think we're having that conversation without actually directly having it. I think our addiction to our phone is about trying to find some online simulacrum of a community that's like perfectly primed and proper, right? And made just for you, where they're only the things that you care about and that they give you a sense of identity, right? Because you care about them. You think about like the concept of ghosting, right? Like before the internet, you couldn't ghost somebody. You kind of just had to see them, right? And so it forced you to actually learn how to have hard conversations. And look, there's a public good to living in a society where people can have hard conversations, right? Where you don't just leave somebody wondering like, where'd you go, right? Where you're just like, hey, listen, I just want to tell you like, it was great. Not going to be great in the future. Like, I just think we got to move our separate ways. And I hope that we can have a great relationship moving forward, just not this one. Like, I would rather live in a society, like take the John Rawls idea. I want to live in a society where people don't ghost each other, right? So if you're interested in that question of how do we build a society worth living in, I think public service is like fundamental to that. And so long as good people want to serve the public, right, then we can have those nice things. And you got to believe that we can have nice things as much as there are really bad people who want to take them away.
So that's a good segue to my last question, which is, what gives you hope? Like, what are you most optimistic about in this moment? We were talking about the fact that it seems very dire in public health right now, but you made a great point to me earlier that there are more people than ever who need our help. So there's inherent, for the lack of a better word, opportunity in addressing that need. But what else gives you hope and optimism in this moment right now?
Yeah, you guys. I mean, you all are out here doing this work, and as painful as it seems, remember we live in communities, and there are communities that are doing really important stuff. Now it's about to get a lot harder, right? But sometimes, I think a lot about playing sports, and if you're ever in a situation where you're like just losing, sometimes the reason you show up for the next play or the next practice or whatever is for the other people on the team, And I think so long as we have enough folks on this team, I think we can keep showing up for each other, and that's what's going to help us win. The other point is, like, existentially, I know in my bones that no matter who you are, you really don't want to live in the society that they have planned for us. You just don't. You may not know it yet, but it's only a matter of time. And rather than get in the sort of like blame game of, well, you're the ones who did, I'd rather just be right there and be like, you still like it? You still think it's great? is this what you meant by great again? Right? It doesn't feel very great to me. And also I have a lot of issues with when again was, but that's a different question. But like, can we make it great? Forget again, just can we make it great? And if so, then here's some things I think we probably could do that would be better for you and better for me. And the zero sum of it all, right? I just think I've been in too many great groups of people to believe in zero sum thinking. Every time like you're in a good group of people, it's so much better because there are more of us, right? And so that to me gives me a lot of hope. And so I'm grateful to you all for the work that you all do. And I think as long as we keep showing up for each other, we've got to believe that the world can be better. But don't succumb to the logic that tells you that blaming somebody, you can blame a couple people, but like blaming one of your neighbors, right, is going to somehow make it better. It won't, right? So we've got to be a part of living out the kind of world that we want to build for ourselves and our kids. And so you guys are doing that.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great point and time to open it up to questions. So Abdullah is going to go around with a mic because we are live streaming this. So folks on Zoom will be able to hear you. So who has questions for Abdul? Don't be shy. Yeah, Patrick. Thanks for volunteering.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been great. So just as we were sitting here, I got a text from a queer provider who's a therapist back in Philadelphia who works at the Mazzoni Center that their website just was pulled down. They're a federally qualified health center that primarily serves queer people. And so they are swinging big. The administration is swinging big. And so with that in mind, how does public health swing big? What is it that we can do beyond having these important conversations, which I think it's so valued to have a space to talk about these things, but what else can we do as harm right now is happening to so many communities, and it's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear that. That's awful for your friend. That's awful for all of the folks that that critical institution serves. And I think there are a couple things. I'm really quite moved by the argument that says that all these executive orders are not a sign of strength, they're a sign of weakness. If you were serious about fundamentally reforming American society, you would pass this through by law. And I think they can't. And I think they know it. And so this is about coming out with a lot of bluster. And I think what we have to do is defend what's here and then think about what, and I don't like this term attack, it's too violent, but like what the response is. And I actually think that we need to be taking on big dragons. And in some respects, to me, it's like public health was its best when we named names and we took on Goliath and we won, right? Like the FDA exists because of swill milk, which would poison children, right? It exists because back in the day in slaughterhouses, if an impoverished worker lost their thumb, it just became part of somebody's ground beef. And we built and people built institutions to take that on. You think about the fight over big tobacco. That's a big fight. And at the time, tobacco was a thing that people looked on really fondly. Like we take for granted that like tobacco is just bad. Like my 7-year-old daughter will go and shame somebody for smoking, right? But like there was a time there's a normal thing that people just did after dinner. And like if you didn't do it, it's kind of weird, right? And we fought that fight and we won. And so my question is, what's the next one? I think you guys have a sense that I think it's probably big tech, but right? I think we need to go find our dragon and take it on. And I think in taking it on, what we're doing is we're architecting a way of thinking and a movement, the potential for a movement that is bigger than the sum of its parts. Now, there's something about narrative where, everybody loves an underdog, right? Permit me a sports analogy here. I don't know who to root for when it comes to the Super Bowl this week. On the one hand, Philadelphia is an underdog. And on the other, a three-peat would be really interesting. But I'm still going to root for Philadelphia. You know why? Because I love an underdog. And
From Philly, so yes, go Birds.
That's a good answer.
you were giving me the look. And I think we need to adopt that logic a little bit, right? The tough part is we're so bought into like defending what we have because we've been in this like world of insecurity where stuff just gets taken away from us. And I actually think we need to get past that debate, right? It's like, what's the big dragon we're about to go after? And I think we can win the public on that debate. I think it's a pretty easy debate to have, but we got to be willing to go on the attack. And we're so busy thinking about what else they're going to take away from us. That doesn't solve, this is the thing, right? Like I can imagine you thinking, okay, so, but what about this really critical clinic? I think that the best way to save that critical clinic is to make sure people understand it's a part of a bigger fight, right? Not just it's this institution. No, this is about whether or not we are willing to take on people who make a lot of money hurting us and our children. Are we or are we not? Because if we are, this is what we do. And if we're not, that's fine. We can go be cowards somewhere else. That's cool. But like, this is the fight. And I just think we need to set it up in, like, to your question about a big swing, we got to set it up in those grand, in that grand question of, do we take on the really, really powerful folks who have been hurting people? This is not a new thing. It's been happening forever, right? What's the next one? Here we go. That's where we're going.
Thanks for that great question, Patrick. Other questions? Yeah, Liz. Yeah, thanks for coming.
So sort of on that note, websites going down, all kinds of things happening like that. Part of the goal here is to bombard us and to frighten people and to make people feel overwhelmed so that they don't feel like they know how to respond. It makes me wonder about sort of what Timothy Snyder calls obeying in advance. That, for example, people get scared and they automatically think that they have to change their behavior, shutting down clinics, et cetera. What are your thoughts about sort of real resistance in the sense that people don't necessarily obey in advance and that they hold strong to their values, even though, as we know, in public health and in all sorts of different areas, that could lead to severe consequences individually for people as well as institutions?
Yeah, I really appreciate your question. I would have told you that all of us owe it to everything we believe in to fight like hell. And I would have said that before I had kids. And I still think we all owe it, but I also understand why a lot of folks are not in a position to fight. I understand. And there's a lot of real damage that they can do to lives and livelihoods. And at the same time, I'll just tell you how I'm thinking about it. I got a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old. They're both ethnically half Egyptian and ethnically half Indian. They're Muslim. And they're girls. And I don't love the America they're growing up in. And so, on the one hand, my instinct is to keep my head down, just make sure I can like build for them, protect their equities, and like hope for the best. And the other is I've read too much history. And, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? If not here, then where? So I think what we have to do is sort of ask, all right, like, when you get ready to go, you protect the things that you can protect. And then remember that, like, if all of us succumb to our individual thinking, then we give in, right? To a world that none of us deserve and none of us will like, right? And when I say us, I mean all of us, even people who voted for him and supported him. So I just think that there's a responsibility to like think through that, but also to be very clear-eyed about what you're headed into. And also to recognize that like there is no room to shame people who are not willing to give it up. You know what I mean? But I've struggled a lot with the question of sacrifice. I really have. Like, I mean, when it's funny, it's like the last time he got elected, I quit my job and ran for governor. And at that point I had no kids. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't very different life situation. So quit my job, like moved in with my in-laws who were amazing and like fought the best fight I knew how. Right. And This time around, it's funny because a lot of my coworkers look at me like a dead man walking. They're just like, "You're not gonna be around for long." I was like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "I don't know, man. It's just like the way of the world. Trump wins the election, and then you run for office." and it's funny because I'm like, yeah, that actually would have been immediately my instinct. And I just, every time I see my kids, I kind of want to cuddle them. And I'm like, that's a lot of work. And I may not see you, like truly may not see you. And then, even if everything works out, there's gonna be a lot of time I don't see you. You may not know who I am. The last time I ran, like, I gave a keynote a couple months after my campaign had ended. And we brought my then 1-year-old daughter and she was sitting with my wife. And I get up to speak and it's like super late. And most of the time they don't travel with me to things like this, but we have family in Chicago, so she decided to come. And I get up to go speak and my daughter got a huge voice, all right, for like a 1-year-old. She's like, Baba, 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 Baba. I was like, hi, Emily, how are you? And everybody thought it was super cute. And my wife is sitting there like, she's been like, we've been wrangling this kid. And I'm like, she's trying to it's like 4 hours past bedtime. And we finally get back into the car. And I was like, oh, that was a really nice event. And she just looks at me. She's like, you just make sure that that's not the only way she ever knows you. And I've been thinking about that for a very long time. So sacrifice is real. It costs a lot to put yourself on whatever the front lines are, and you put a lot at risk. But again, if we don't do it, so I don't have an answer. That was just my weird musings on it.
Jackie.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been thinking about a lot of this as well. And I think that there is this really serious tension that is happening where a lot of people who have the most to lose are willing to risk it all and are willing to act defiantly and, pursue their work in a way that is resistance, with leadership on top then doing bipartisanship and caving into and preemptively yielding ground. And I'm wondering how it is that even within public health, that how is it that people who maybe do not have the power, don't have the ultimate decision-making, but don't have the decision-making power, but have the ethic, can push back on institutional leaders who are now claiming bipartisanship and are willing to yield in advance?
I really appreciate that question. I think, and maybe I'm just getting old. The younger version of me would have said, I have no time for folks who don't see the urgency of this and are unwilling to leverage their power for change. I came across a really great quote just recently, and I think it summarizes a little bit of where I am on this now, which is having gone through a couple of cycles, right? There are people who have authentically different approaches to a theory of change. And I think the thing that I am thinking a lot about is, how has my theory of change evolved? And the Burke quote that I'm going to get to here is, at times I do not say the truth so that I may speak the truth a little bit longer. Which is to say that the instinct to go in immediately at top volume may sometimes be less effective than being able to be patient and to speak the truth effectively. And what you say in public sometimes prevents you from being able to speak a word of truth in private. Now, I don't know what's in people's minds, right? And look, there is a world in which there's a lot of cowardice around us, right? There's no doubt about that. But I also think that it's important for us as folks who have an instinct to go to the front line to ask, how do we accommodate folks who may believe like we believe, but just have a different position from which to engage, a different set of equities to manage, and a different theory of change. That's not to say that we should accommodate all of it, but that is to say that I also think that sometimes for us, there is, the analogy I'll use because it snowed here today is like when you get stuck in a snowbank, your instinct, like if somebody's never driven in the snow, when they get stuck, their instinct is to rev the wheels as hard as possible, right? Because it seems that the harder you hit the gas, the higher the probability that you're going to be able to get out of snowbank. But we all know what happens, right? You melt the snow, and now you're stuck in a thing of ice, and now you're not going anywhere, right? But instead, what you kind of have to do is like rock it, right? And you got to find the internal melody of the car until you finally rocked it enough that you can get it one little hit, and now you're out of the snowbank, right? And I think that sometimes it's just is helpful for us to be asking, all right, with some of these folks who aren't moving, what is the best thing I can say to them to get them to do the thing that I need them to do? The other example I'll give you is like, there's a person at procurement, I'm not using her real name, but her name is Sue, for all intents and purposes. Sue has been at the county for like 20 years. Sue could care less what I think. But Sue is absolutely critical for me to getting my program, whatever program, off the ground. Now, there are days that I could go in and just be like, Sue, why do you hate public health? But I've realized that like actually the best thing I can do to Sue is be her best friend, right? Look out for her. I've given Sue so many awards. Like I know all of Sue's grandchildren. Like Sue and I are bosom friends. And that's because I need Sue. And I need Sue not to care about this the way I care about it, but I need her to care about it for some reason, right? And it's just more effective. So I just think that sometimes like we've got to, even if it's frustrating, there's a question of saying, how can I get this thing where I need it to go when my instinct is to just push it as hard as I possibly can, right? Because I'm that way, right? Like my instinct is always like, go hard, go hard, go hard, go harder. If it's not working, go harder, right? And I just think maybe like, I've been around a couple times to be like, well, go harder. Okay, is there like a smarter that I could do? Is there a more patient that I could do? Is there a, like, this person's just never going to move, so I can bypass them and find somebody else that I can do? Is there a, like, I can create an outside circumstance for you that's going to change your thinking? Is there a story I can tell you? Is there like a relationship we can build? And I just think on this notion of like this idea of platforming we talked about earlier, I just think sometimes it's worth us asking, what does this person need to hear to move? Is it like, to use Kaufman, who are the epidemiologists in the room? All right, so Kaufman, very famous epidemiologist, has this idea that like when you think about a public health intervention, there are the doomed, there are the immune, and then there are the people who are susceptible to the intervention, right? There are some people who are doomed. There's nothing I can do that's going to make you change. You're just stuck. There are the immune that are always going to do the right thing. I don't have to spend any energy, you're just going to do the right thing, right? And then there are the folks in the middle. So the question is, what is the right intervention for these people? And not all interventions are the same. And I think sometimes like it's just being patient about like what intervention and how do I time it to get this person to potentially move. And they may not move, but then it's on me to try again because I want the outcome, right? Rather than the and I also say the release of feeling like I let them have it. You know what I mean?
So I think we might have time for one more quick question and then we'll wrap up. Yeah, Julia.
You just gave me some great parenting tips. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you're going to have to remind me what those are.
You really astutely mentioned a minute ago about speaking to people clearly, frankly, in ways that folks can understand and can get behind what you're saying. And you also mentioned how, big tech was the next big dragon. How do you connect those dots when speaking to people who may not share your point of view and getting them to see the viewpoint that there are a couple of extremely wealthy men, pulling the strings at the top right now?
I think we have to be really good at narrating people's stories to them, which is to say, I want you to think a little bit about, especially folks who remember a pre-social media, I want you to think about the experience of reading a book when you were in college. I used to be able to read for a long, long time. Now, if I read something that's more than 300 characters, I got to look at something else that's 300 characters. I forget. I'll pull up my phone and forget why I pull out my phone. Is this you too? I wonder what has happened, right? And I think when you start getting people to think about the collectivization of their own experience, they're like, oh, shoot, you too? And you're like, yeah, me too. So what has changed in the interim since 2007, right? Now I have a fully functional computer in my pocket that makes me think, and it buzzes at me and it dings and it like There are multiple companies on my phone that are spending trillions of dollars to figure out how best to get me to look at it and to stay looking at it for a very long time. And that's me. As somebody, like I was one of like the first 10,000 people on Facebook. And it was all downhill from there. And then I think about any teenager, and you ask them, like, picture your teenager in their most likely modal form. And most of them will say, sitting on a couch with a phone in their face. And you're like, is that what your teenager experience was like? It wasn't mine. And then ask yourself about whether or not they derive more joy or more sorrow and pain out of that thing, right? How many times did you have to end up trying to clean up a thing that happened online because now they're watching all their friends do something together that they're excluded in, or some stupid ass chat group that was created just to exclude them to talk about what they're wearing at school today, right? And then ask yourself how many people statistically have killed themselves because of that. And ask yourself whether or not we think this is good. And I think when you start to narrate that experience to people, and they're like, wait, it's just so normal, because this is the problem. We're all, by definition, stuck in what our normal is. And we see it as normal because that's what our day-to-day is. And like, there has to be a contrast that you can give to people and be like, okay, here's the contrast. And when we see it in the light of the contrast, then you start to say, oh, wow, like that actually, this is really broken. And then you ask yourself, okay, so who are the people who lined up behind President Trump at his inauguration? All of those people, right? And then ask yourself what they're worth collectively, $450 billion. So their $450 billion was money that was spent by advertisers to make sure that our eyes were stuck on on our phones for as long as possible. It's decimated our communities. It has broken our attention. It has robbed us of the things that we love most in our lives. It's created huge amounts of conflict. It has literally killed people. So how is this not the greatest existential public health challenge of our time? And I think when you start to narrate that to people, they see it, you know, and there's an enemy. Like, we know who's doing it, right? Now, look, again, the argument is always going to be like, well, there's some good of social media. I'm like, yeah, sure, there is, for sure. Don't get me wrong. Like, my online fitness community, which can do no wrong except for RFK. But is it worth the price? Like, is it worth the price? Is your life better now than it was in 2007 before you had an iPhone, right? And then even if you wanted to break out, could you really? Like, talk to any teenager and be like, yeah, you don't have to look at your phone all day. They'd be like, my whole life sits in this stupid phone. Like, what am I going to do? Like, exclude myself from everything? And it's true, right? It's funny, like, I remember freshman year at the University of Michigan and like trying to make my friends and figure out, like, you know, going to whatever social event was happening to try and meet new people. And like, it's actually really sad. My wife's nephew is a freshman, and like, they all just sit in their dorms on their phones. It's like, I'm like, you're right there. Anyway, so.
Well, we're just about out of time. So if you could all join me in thanking Abdul for this amazing conversation.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.